Welcome to session 69 in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. If you're new to this, I'll tell you all about it in just a minute, but first I want to highlight the work that we're going to be considering and going through and delving into in this particular session. It is Blue Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson, which is, as you might know, the culmination of this entire series, or as he's going to tell us in an interview that we'll look at a little bit later, one single gigantic novel, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars, taking place over a span of hundreds of years and in a pretty vast panorama, which will extend to the entirety of the solar system by about 2/3 of the way through Blue Mars. The first two books are primarily about Earth and Mars and the colonization and terraforming, the making, Earth-like, or Earth-similar, we should say, Earthoid, the Martian landscape and entire ecosystem, creating one. So Worlds of Speculative Fiction is a series that we started back in 2016, largely as an excuse for me to do some guilty pleasure reading in speculative fiction, going back to classics of science fiction, fantasy, horror, and other genres as well. It was hosted by the Brookfield Public Library and went on from 2016 to early 2020. 2020 was, of course, the year of COVID, so everybody had to stay at home, and we couldn't go to the library anymore for our in-depth discussions that we were holding. And eventually I figured out how to do it online like we're doing here. So what we do is I'll present for about 90 minutes, some of which is going to be, bringing up particularly important passages from the text and talking about philosophical themes. We're also going to talk a lot about world building because it is Worlds of Speculative Fiction. And if it was the first session on Robinson, I would be doing biography, as we did in the previous one, talking about, when his works came out and his life and all of that. We're not going to do that this time around, but we will be looking at some additional interviews that are very revealing about the Mars trilogy in general, about Blue Mars, and about his thoughts about the major themes of, say, environmentalism or utopia or sustainability or where humanity is going that play such a major role within these texts. So what we're going to be doing first is, I don't want to, jump right into the interviews, although they provide some great locuses for what we're going to discuss. I'd like to talk a bit about the world building in broad outlines that isn't just happening in these two works. We're actually going to be leaving these more or less behind, but the world building happening in Blue Mars itself. World building here is going to be a rather loaded term, as we're going to see. And then, we'll look at some of these really important interviews and what they have to reveal, and then we'll talk about major philosophical themes that come up and are explored and outlined, sometimes in the mouths of characters, in Blue Mars, and then we'll bring it to a successful close. This is, of course, the second of two sessions. In the first session, we worked our way through Red Mars and Green Mars. Now we're coming to an end of this particular series. And as we're going to see in the interviews, Kim Stanley Robinson himself, although he's very happy about the work that he did in the Mars trilogy, doesn't actually think that these do provide us with a blueprint anymore for the possible colonization of Mars. But they do provide us with modes of thinking about these matters, and they're a great story as well, which should never be left aside when we're talking about fiction. Is it something that's not just teaching us or presenting us with interesting models or thought experiments? Does it entertain? And I think that the answer for these works, Red Mars, Green Mars, and Blue Mars, is that Kim Stanley Robinson does manage to pull that off at many points. So settle in. We're going to talk about the world building going on in these novels, and in particularly in Blue Mars. And then we'll look at some interesting interviews. Then we'll talk about some big philosophical themes, zeroing in on important passages within the work. This video series is called Worlds of Speculative Fiction, so world building is really quite central to it, and more of that is happening as we progress from Red Mars to Green Mars to Blue Mars, which we're looking at today. And as I remarked in the previous session where we were discussing these first two volumes in the massive novel that Robinson has put together here, spanning 3 different books, there's not just world building in the conventional sense of, thinking about like, well, what is the continents and where is the weather going and what are the peoples, and maybe I'll do something on their language. Instead, Robinson is taking our world, namely Earth, and our solar system and the most easily terraformable, colonizable planet Mars, and then he's developing entire worlds out of that. So he's not beginning with a completely new narrative universe. He is projecting ahead. And as we're going to see him talking about in interviews, this is really quite important. The fact that it's not, space opera located in the galaxy, flitting from planet to planet with myriad exotic cultures or some fantasy novel. Instead, this is about building and transforming a world. And the world, of course, that's talked about most is Mars, which makes perfect sense. But Mars doesn't exist, couldn't exist, as a human world in isolation from the mother world, Earth. And there's going to be lots and lots of back and forth and tensions. By the midpoint, or a little bit past the midpoint of Blue Mars, it's no longer going to be just Earth and Mars. It'll also be Venus and Mercury, and going all the way out to Uranus and, Jupiter and Saturn and all of this other cool colonization stuff that's going on. But Earth and Mars are going to be kind of driving it. So I think that in order to talk about world building, we have to be attentive to several different things. One is, for Blue Mars, there is indeed a backstory, an incredibly determinative and important backstory from these first 2 novels. So we'll have to talk about that a little bit. And then we can talk about Mars itself and the contrast between, there's many different factions, you could say, but the most important division is between the Reds and the Greens, and their different viewpoints on what should be done in terraforming or area forming or with the aerophony, right? All these things that are about Eris or Mars. And then we have to talk about the fact that, as Robinson is going to stress over and over again, we do have environments, we do have landscapes, we do have entire planetary ecologies, and we could even say system ecologies, right? Because they're bringing things from outside of Earth and Mars into Mars at certain points. But we have to talk about human beings. And this is often where world building goes, right? As I mentioned just a little bit earlier, classic world building. Let's people some continents on a map with a bunch of different distinct ethnicities or tribes, each of which has its own interesting history and perhaps language. Okay, that is world building. what Robinson is doing is projecting human beings as they are forward several hundred years in this grand story. So the backstory part, right, that we have to discuss, I think perhaps the most important aspect that we can talk about, which is happening in each of these books and is happening towards the end of this final book, is the notion of revolution. Earth sends up colonists, at first just 100, specially trained scientists, each of whom has been cleared for certain things, up to Mars on a essentially one-way trip. It won't be completely one-way for a few of the original 100, and they start building a colony on Mars, eventually developing a place under hill and all sorts of, other places around, and they have divisions about what they think Mars ought to look like. And pretty quickly, things go off the original plan, the original script, that the original mandate, not least because one of them, Hiroko, smuggles a 101st passenger, a stowaway, on board, Quixote, right? Who is she knows, and we find this out much more in Green Mars, but he's sighted, and eventually more and more people start coming. They build a gigantic space elevator to facilitate that travel, and more colonists come from Earth. And there's a lot of discussions and divisions about how precisely this effort of colonization is going to work. Some countries are seeing it as a potential answer to the overpopulation problems, particularly India and China, but several others as well. And the original two main powers, the United States and Russia, who are sending people up, it's hard to imagine at this point that there would be this sort of cooperation between the current United States and current Russia, but these are written back in the 90s, of course. So, there's treaties that are set in place, plans, and these are fairly quickly violated and ignored. And, Earth attempts to assert a kind of control over what's going to happen on this developing planet of Mars. Political control, economic control, military control, you could even say ecological control. And eventually the Martians fight back. There's an actual revolution. The space elevator is cut in incredible feat. It's attached to an asteroid up at the top. And this, the cord for the elevator wraps around Mars at the equator, causing incredible devastation. But Mars is able to attain a certain degree of independence from the forces on Earth that are attempting to control, to guide, to colonize the colony, you could say, right? To steer it in a very different direction where it would be essentially an appendage, subservient to Earth. And that's, what happens by the end of Red Mars and leading into Green Mars. They eventually are going to build a second space elevator, and there's going to be all sorts of back and forth things going on, developments happening on Earth. The, transnational corporations eventually become meta-national corporations, much more powerful than many countries, start running the show. They actually fight against each other. Some benign, even benevolent, meta-national organizations also arise, including the Swiss Praxis group. And the Martians themselves are trying to figure out, what are we going to do? And there's all these different competing visions and models for how to steer the human part of this rapidly changing, evolving planet, which we'll get to in just a bit. One of the massive environmental matters that allows there to be a second revolution, which is happening by the end of Green Mars, is an environmental catastrophe on Earth. And that environmental catastrophe happens because of some volcanic eruptions in Antarctica underneath the ice shelf, which causes the ice shelf, at least half of it, to break off and fall into the ocean, raising ocean levels not by the sort of little projections that we have at present if global warming continues without being checked, where it's going to rise 6 feet. No, it is in the double digits, which is just devastating for countries that are incredibly tied to their coastlines and to their water levels. And it causes great suffering, great instability all across the earth, and leads to a situation in which the Martians can once again not just rebel or revolt, but have a genuine revolution where they are going to change the dynamics of power in relation to Earth and Mars, and by the beginning of Blue Mars. I mean, it's actually being discussed in Green Mars. By the beginning of Blue Mars, the Martians are saying we should go and help as much as we can the people on Earth. And now this help is going to take several different forms. Going down there's really interesting discussions about what it's like to go from a Martian environment and gravity down to this incredibly messy planet that we call Earth, right? Some brilliant discussions of that, but also to bring to Earth, some new, or actually not so new, but newly implemented political ideals. Politics is incredibly important. How we organize our societies, who calls the shots, who runs things, incredibly important. And the Martians, in some respect, have an edge on what's happening on Earth. So, there's also, products that are coming from Mars, mostly raw materials. That's actually going to become more of an issue with some of the other places. But mining is going on, and that's quite important. And Earth is able to more or less get stabilized, and then the matters sort of come about anew, and they begin to send more and more people, or to insist at first on sending more and more people to Mars, again to try to deal with the population problems. And the Martians are posed with a real key problem. Are they going to use force? Are they going to resort to war to repel these different, what do you want to call them, aggressors, colonizers, pawns of their national or metanational politics? And that's going to lead to the third Martian revolution, which is going to happen at the end of Blue Mars, which we'll hopefully talk about as a theme in just a bit. So that's massive amounts of backstory, and some of the characters, have been developed in the earlier books, and we see them emerging in Blue Mars, and some of them are changing. Some of them are very familiar to the early, to the readers of the early books: Sax Russell, Michael, Anne, all these different people, often many of whom are in the 100, or Nergal, Jackie. They're all going to attain important positions and represent things going on there. So let's come back and talk a little bit about the world building that is happening through terraforming. Now, if you haven't read any of these books, then one of the things we have to say right off the bat is Mars is essentially a lifeless planet. And in order for it to be habitable, you not only need a breathable atmosphere, which they're working towards eventually, but lots and lots of water and nitrogen for the soil. It doesn't even have soil in the proper sense, because, what we actually need in order to grow things is organic matter. Right? Life requires previous life, you could say. So at the very beginning of Red Mars, they begin with things like bacteria and lichen and all that. And by the time that we're getting to Green Mars, it is Green Mars in part because they've managed to make large parts of Mars green. That is, caught up with life, or to bring in a very important concept, viriditas, right? Which assumes a kind of philosophical value in the course of these novels. Blue Mars, good reason to call it Blue Mars. What's blue? Well, ideally water. And so a significant part of the terraforming is actually producing bodies of water on Mars and keeping them from freezing so that they can actually keep up the heating cycle and make room for all sorts of organisms. By the time that we get to the early parts of Blue Mars, we have apex predators like modified polar bears, which, if you think about what that would require, an entire food chain to support them, right? So Mars is being developed into like Earth, a living cosmos, or at least a cosmos of great life, great variety. Nowhere near what's on Earth, because, they're kind of kick-starting things. And among them are human beings. And human beings are the ones who are reshaping this entire world and who are also shaping themselves in the process. One last thing that we should talk about that figures into that. Human beings, one of the key aspects of us is technology. And so, new developments in technology, for example, having a space elevator or being able to colonize Mars at all, or being able to bring these things and carry out genetic manipulation, all of those are incredibly important. One of the things that turns out to be quite disruptive is the human quest for, if not immortality, at least extended good life. And they do come up with a, manner of doing this, which is part of what leads to the instability on Earth. The rich can afford these treatments, the poor cannot. And the world is divided between rich and poor. Most of the Martians will, in fact, use the treatments. And this is going to lead, not so much on Mars, which is a growing territory, able to take in quite a few more people, although not as many as the Earth would like to send up. On Earth, this leads to a massive demographic problem, which will actually have to be solved with controlling natality, controlling the amount of children that people can have. So that's a really important aspect. And then by the time that we get to the end of Blue Mars, we're finding something kind of similar in terms of treatments, but now dealing with memory. Yet another place to explore. And you could say that the world building that's going on here, almost entirely through the eyes or dialogue of characters, is revealing to us just how rich, complex, and extensive of a universe with worlds in it we could possibly have. So that's probably enough about world building. That's enough to get everybody up on speed. Let's look now at some of the things that Robinson has had to say that I think will be quite helpful for us in understanding the series as a whole and Blue Mars in particular. I've tracked down and read through a number of recent interviews with Kim Stanley Robinson that in some way or another concern this work, Blue Mars and the Mars Trilogy, as well as some other important themes and the larger context of his writing, and you could even say advocacy. And I'd like to share them with you along with some commentary, because I think this will help illuminate some of the key themes and developments within the novel itself, and to help situate it within a larger context in which Robinson is presenting his own work, and we might even say deliberate calling as an author. So the first one is on the blog of Andrew Liptak, the interview that he carried out there, I believe in 2015. 15 or so. So he says, the Mars books cover a lot of ground: colonization, politics, corporations, environment. What particular challenges did you have in assembling the books? And Robinson says, well, it was a long project, but I wasn't doing anything else in those years except taking care of my family as a house husband, so I had the time and the focus to go long. The challenges, I guess, involved keeping a sense of the flow of the work and keeping the balance between the various point of view characters, and then above all, figuring out what happened next in the story, and why and how. It was basically the usual novel writing problems, but extended over a long time and a lot of pages. 6 years, 1,700 pages. And so then, Liptak says, well, what was the writing process like? In my copy of Red Mars, your blurb mentions you were hard at work in writing Green Mars when you wrote the first book. Did you know what would be in store for book 3? Robinson says, I knew all along I wanted to tell the story of the terraforming of Mars and the creation of a new human society there, multicultural, and in certain ways kind of utopian compared to now. So I knew that much, which was enough to guide me through the process of figuring out what should happen along the way. When I started writing the book in 1989, I quickly realized it was going to be a very long book, and my agent and editor of that time said to me, Stan, we call that a trilogy. So I shifted the title from Green Mars, which was my idea for the title for the whole book, to Red, Green, and Blue Mars. Now, that's quite interesting, isn't it? So Green Mars is, of course, in the middle, and that was supposed to be the totality of this. Imagine how dense this book would be. I mean, these are each one pretty significant tomes if they were bound together in one single volume. Then he goes on, and he's asked, what was the publication process like? Did you integrate any new scientific information about Mars into your books? Robinson says, well, publication was straightforward, led by my editor in England, who always got the books out first and encouraged me greatly through the process. There was not much new information about Mars in the years I wrote, but what information there was came out packaged in a huge anthology from the University of Arizona called Mars in 1992, and it gave me new things to say in Green and Blue Mars. And then he says something very interesting here. It looked like I'd saved good things for later in the trilogy, but actually I learned them while writing and did not know them before, so that was a nice thing to happen. And then he's asked another thing. What did you learn from your California trilogy you applied to writing for your Mars trilogy? And then what did you learn from your Mars books you applied to the ones that came after? And, he says the lesson that I applied to the Mars trilogy had to do with, writing a novel and moving around in a point of view from one character to another, so the reader got different perspectives on the characters in the story, but everything was done on a larger scale. And then he says, I wanted to do more exposition, to talk about history directly, to tell a global story. So there were negative lessons as well as positive. Now, from the Mars trilogy, I learned that I could use a similar format to tell a global story that covered centuries, which helped me hugely when I wrote later The Years of Rice and Salt. After that, the help was more indirect. I think I could say, now this is a fascinating thing, I think I could say the Mars trilogy made me fearless. After doing that, I was willing to try anything. So you could say, although the Mars trilogy is not a proof of concept, as we're going to see, for colonization of Mars, it was a proof of concept for Robinson and his further writing. A little bit later, he's asked, Mars is one of the first destinations for science fiction ever since someone misinterpreted the word canali. Wells, Burroughs, and Bradbury have all set stories on the Red Planet. Did this figure into how you developed your own trilogy? And Robinson says, Mars is a great science fiction story space. In the way that they talk about the matter of Britain when they talk about all the Arthurian legends, science fiction has the matter of Mars. In each generation since the time of Percival Lowell, the Mars presented by the scientists has been taken up by sci-fi writers to become a new story space. All that got hugely sharpened in focus in 1969 and 1976 when Mariner and Viking gave us the planet in so much more detail than we'd ever had before. But the fundamental truths of the human relation to Mars were mostly set out by Bradbury's Martian Chronicles. The Martians are us. We will change there. The ghosts of our stories about the place will always haunt us when we really get there. These are permanent truths and things I wanted to join and emphasize in my own Mars novel. So in this interview, we see some reflection on the previous approaches to Mars, the kind of story that he's trying to tell, what he's learning, how he's progressing as an author. Then there's this issue about, these stories are set in what we could call our near future, within essentially a few lifetimes from now. And, is it actually possible for us to terraform Mars, to turn it into a place that we might colonize, even escape to from an Earth that is clearly in lots of trouble? And at the time that he wrote the trilogy, that was kind of a possibility. That's why he wrote the trilogy. He's asked about that in several other interviews. So in the Sacktown interview, the interviewer says, "We've made quite a hash of this planet. Bottom line, can humans really terraform Mars? Is it feasible? Is space going to be the next frontier for human life?" Here's what Robinson says. "I will say this. I would claim my Mars trilogy is a good novel. It really is just a 3-volume novel. I don't like series as a word, but not a good plan. There is no planet B. And we learned things about Mars since I finished my Mars trilogy. Blue Mars, the last installment, came out in 1996. That actually make terraforming it much more difficult. The surface is poisonous with perchlorates. That's a new finding. More and more we're worried about what cosmic radiation does to the brain. Mars' lack of a magnetic field means that it's not going to be safe for humans until you really are well terraformed. And that now looks to be thousands of years away. Then there's nowhere near as much nitrogen as there ought to be in an ordinary planet. Nobody knows why. And you need nitrogen for a biosphere. Terraforming Mars might take 10,000 years. And we've got a 100-year emergency right here. So the timescales are ridiculously off. I have to explain this every time people bring up Mars because the Mars trilogy is still my most famous work by a long shot. We see a follow-up or, another similar line here in the Far Sight interview, which we'll look at in a little bit more extensively. So the interviewer says, "You're a science fiction writer, not a climate scientist, but you were a speaker at the 2021 UN Climate Change Conference, as well as at numerous other science conferences, and you've worked with the U.S. National Science Foundation. What can you contribute that the world's foremost scientists cannot?" And this goes to what maybe is here in these works. So Robinson responds in this way. It says 3 things. The future as subject for speculation, the syncretic combination of all the fields into a holistic vision of civilization, and lastly, narrative as a mode of knowing. Actually, I think all scientific papers are narratives in much the same way short stories are, but they have different forms and different relations to their subject materials, so that the narrative element, often quite similar to a detective story, is obscured. What science fiction can do is tell the human stories implied by scientific discoveries and venture from descriptions of what is to speculations of what ought to be or what we ought to avoid. Now, I want to pause on that for a moment. So he outlined three important things. Future is subject for speculation. That's not a big surprise, right? Speculative fiction is indeed speculating. Narrative is a mode of knowing. I think you've heard enough about that already. It's kind of fascinating to think about scientific papers as concealing a narrative, but it's really quite true. We don't do science in some sort of synchronic vacuum. It is something that is done as a human set of processes. But here's the most important one, I think the second one. A syncretic combination, so bringing together, right? Syncretizing is fusing, synthesizing, taking bits and pieces from different things and forming them into an integrated whole of all the fields into a holistic vision. Okay, so, what we hear here is something like what philosophers used to say. We're the discipline that can bring together all these different fields and make sense of them in a, holistic account that these other fields can't. Here, it's the novelist who's able to do that, but only a certain kind of novelist. But it's not a syncretic vision or holistic vision of science as such, or the human disciplines. It's of civilization. And this all too often is left out, not just by the scientists, but by the engineers, by the bureaucrats, by the business people, by all these other groups, the politicians, with their own particular point of view. Robinson is saying that in this, he is bringing together, and in his other novels, the possibility of a wider and deeper vision. So that's important. Let's come back to the interview. To what extent, he's asked, do you believe climate fiction can influence political decisions today or make readers take active steps to mitigate climate change? What makes speculative fiction a powerful modeling exercise for climate futures or futures in general? So Robinson says, well, people understand things through narratives, including the future. Everyone is the science fiction writer of their own life. Isn't that a great line, right? We're all speculating about where we're going. Even if we're not doing science fiction proper, we're all doing science fiction in a certain way. When hoping for a good life and thinking about what might bring that about, we are utopian writers. When fearful that bad things will happen, we are dystopian writers. So this is a very natural mode of thought. When elaborated in detail with thick texture and some lived imaginative time, a speculative fiction can bring into life in the mind one possibility or another, which then can be contemplated as a felt experience, and one's present actions then adjusted accordingly, influenced by experiences that are fictional, yet nevertheless real. He's asked then, in your best-selling Mars trilogy, we follow the process of terraforming Mars, making it more suitable for human living over 2 centuries, while climate disasters devastate the Earth. Do you think that making Mars more habitable to humans is worth the effort, or should we rather concentrate on maintaining the habitability of the Earth? Or are both efforts necessary for humanity's survival and well-being in the long term? Now, notice what the author of this amazing set of novels, or rather one novel in 3 volumes, has to say by way of response. Mars is irrelevant to us now. We should, of course, concentrate on maintaining the habitability of the Earth. My Mars trilogy is a good novel, but not a plan for this moment. If we were to create a sustainable civilization here on Earth with all of Earth's creatures prospering, then and only then would Mars become even the slightest bit interesting to us. It would be a kind of reward for our success. We could think of it in the way my novel thinks of it, as an interesting place worth exploring more. But until we have solved our problems here, Mars is just a distraction for a few escapists, and so worse than useless. So what is he saying there? The plans that people have, like, Elon Musk proposing, we're going to go to Mars and terraform it. That's escapism. That's worse than just doing nothing. What we have to do is fix this planet that we're stuck on now because otherwise Mars, like he says, will be totally irrelevant because, human beings may not even exist anymore. Another question that is a follow-up to this: climate change efforts basically seek to return to the Earth's climate to a 20th century state, yet the planet's climate has changed naturally over the last millions of years without human interference. Is it arrogant to try to preserve the Earth's climate in a more or less static state, even if today's climate changes are man-made rather than natural? Now, this is going to be a really interesting answer here. He says, no, it's not arrogant. It's a survival attempt. Earth's climate does fluctuate a great deal due to natural changes. But what humans have done in the last 200 years equals millions of years of natural change. So we're in a new experiment with no natural precedents. We may have initiated a new hothouse Earth phase, which in the past has meant no ice on the planet and sea levels 270 feet higher than now. Now notice what he says next. Actually, this is a foolish question. I'm going to stop answering it. It does not deserve an answer. I refer you to the IPCC reports and request that you rethink such a foolish idea as that which is expressed in this question. So he's perfectly willing to call the interviewer out onto the carpet for asking. There are dumb questions, right? There are tendentious questions. There are questions that at this point should be resolved or settled by intelligent people. And Robinson is saying, well, this is one of them, and I'm not going to cooperate with you on this question. So then he's asked one final follow-up. Do you have anything you want to add regarding nature and the future? Now, this is another set of great observations. Nature and natural are words with particular weights that are perhaps not relevant now. We're part of a biosphere that sustains us. Half of the DNA in your body is not human DNA. You are a biome like a swamp with a particular balance or ecology that is hard to keep going, and indeed it will only go for a while, after which it falls apart and you die. The world is your body. You breathe it, drink it, eat it. It lives inside you, and you only live and think because this community is doing well. So nature, you are nature. Nature is you. Natural is what happens. The word is useless as a divide. There is no human apart from nature. You have no thoughts or feelings without your body, and the earth is your body. So please dispense with that dichotomy of human, nature, and attend to your own health, which is to say, your biosphere's health. Very interesting reflections there on how we, as human beings, fit into the natural world. We are not something entirely separate from it. The last interview, which is a little bit longer, is from Polygon, and here we're going to get more into thinking about utopia and dystopia, and he's going to bring up something that he learned from Friedrich Jameson, the Gramscian square, or as he's going to call it, rectangle. So let's see what he has to say. So he's asked about science fiction, and he says, if you think of science fiction as just a kind of modeling exercise, everybody's a science fiction writer in their own lives, a theme we've seen come up. You make plans based on modeling in your mind. When you're feeling hopeful, you have a kind of utopian plan. If you do these things, you get to a good place. And then when you're afraid, you have these worries that if you do these things, you get to a bad place. So the fundamental exercise of science fiction is a very natural human thing. And then when it gets written down in long narrative forms like science fiction novels, everybody recognizes the exercise involved there. Although when I say that, I realize that actually lots of people don't like to read science fiction, so they're not recognizing the way books are the same as what they do for their own lives. That's surprising to me, but it happens a lot. Anyway, science fiction is a modeling exercise where all the science fiction put together, especially all the near-future visions, they range from totally horrible to perhaps quite nice. It's heavier weighted at the disaster end than at the utopian end, maybe because it's easier or maybe because it's more shockingly interesting to read. It's not like going to town meetings and reading blueprints or for plumbing facilities. The utopian end of science fiction has a reputation for being a dull, eat your greens type fiction, so there's less of it compared to the disaster stuff. But there is both. And if you read a lot of it, one hopes you're prepared for anything. That isn't 100% true, but you're perhaps better prepared than if you hadn't read it. In that sense, I think science fiction could be a great teaching tool for people. You can't read all science fiction, and if you're reading nothing but space opera, none of this would obtain. Because the problems of spaceships flying faster than light across the galaxy are not always immediately applicable to the situation we're here on Earth. So it's a specific wing of science fiction I'm talking about that could be helpful if people read it. Now let's pause on that for a minute. Science fiction, we're always living in it because we live, as he says, through and in narratives. This could be said by Alistair McIntyre, who doesn't say that about science fiction, but he does say that about other fiction. He thinks about, the Norse Eddas and, commonplace tales and Jane Austen and stuff like that. But why not just as much utopian dystopian fiction like the Mars trilogy? Even if we can't get to Mars and terraform it, there are concerns that are articulated in here, models that are given to us. We might also mention the person who Robinson wrote his dissertation on, Philip K. Dick, who does similar things in his science fiction novels. He gives us problems that we can sink our teeth into, existential situations. Let's go on. We might spend too much time stressing that. Here's the question that's being posed to him. The LA Review of Books referred to you as, quote, our last great utopian visionary. What do you think of that title, or at least the utopian visionary part? He says, I think that's fine. I've rolled the dice towards doing utopian fiction. There isn't very much of it. The canon of utopias could be listed on your fingers and toes. And yet, I think they're very valuable. Occasionally, they have effects in the real world. Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward from 1988 was a big part of the progressive movement 120 years ago. H.G. Wells' utopian novels had a huge impact on the Bretton Woods Agreement and the settlements after World War II. A good utopian novel can, a generation later, or even a few years later, have an impact on how people think the future should go. Then he says something really interesting here. I feel a deep kinship and love for Ursula K. Le Guin and Iain Banks, these two great utopian writers. They've died, and I do feel a bit lonely for my own generation. But I also see a lot of young writers coming up who call themselves solar punk or hope punk or the new utopians and whatnot. They're forming schools. They're trying to get enthusiastic about improving our way to a green future. I think they're utopian, but perhaps a little bit outdated or scared by the term utopia because it's so often used as a weapon to mean unrealistic and never going to happen. So they make up different terms. I'm glad to see these. I don't think utopian fiction will ever go away. It's like a necessary blueprint for thinking our way forward. So it seems like it's a good time for utopian fiction. I'm sad at losing colleagues I loved, but I'm encouraged at the way the genre itself is ratcheting its way back into people's attention. Notice that he's mentioning Iain Banks and Ursula K. Le Guin and all these newer, younger writers. And the fact that maybe utopia isn't a term we want to stress anymore. Maybe we want to do utopia. And this is going to lead us into a really interesting set of discussions, progressions, however you want to call it. So the interviewer says, it's surprising how many classic novels described as utopian fiction are actually disguised as dystopian novels. So Robinson says, this is worth talking about. In the Grimace rectangle, it was referring to A.J. Grimace, the great structural semantics person who developed this four-part square or a rectangle, which we can perhaps talk about later. In the Grimace rectangle, there's the thing that's not you, and then there's the thing that's against you. And these are not the same. In that model, the opposite of utopia is dystopia. But the thing against you is anti-utopia. What that model is saying is if you try to get to utopia, it would necessarily be bad. So it's against the idea of utopia itself. So now we've got utopia, dystopia, anti-utopia. It's just saying we tried and we lost. But anti-utopian ideas say that trying to make utopias necessarily rebound and boomerang into disaster. For example, 1984 is a dystopia. Big Brother is not trying to make you happy. That government is putting its boot on your neck. But Brave New World is the great anti-utopian novel where they try to make everybody happy, so they drug them and electroshock them, and then everyone's supposed to be happy, and it doesn't work. Those two very, very famous novels service the great dystopia and the great anti-utopia. And the fourth term in the rectangle, this comes out of Frederick Jameson's Marxist literary criticism, and of course Grimace's semantic square, would be anti-utopian. This gets super mysterious, but it just refers to insisting it's possible to make a better world. So that's the mysterious fourth term in the particular rectangle. I am anti-utopian, but I'm also utopian, which is a little bit more obvious. So a very interesting set of reflections there. And again, going to the issue of should we label things as utopian? Well, then that immediately, raises the dystopia and the anti-utopia. But maybe there's this fourth possibility, which is anti-utopian and says we do got to make it better, right? This is absolutely essential. And we could think about it in terms of environmental catastrophe. We better make it better or there's no we after a while. Or we could think of it in terms of the classical conception of the good life. A good life that is not just an individual good life, but a good life in community. He goes on, and the interviewer says, supposedly utopian fiction can't have a story because it can't have conflicts or imperfections. How have you approached that problem as you're thinking about this philosophically? This is something that really bears on these works. He says, so one strategy is that you show that in a utopia, it's still possible to be extremely unhappy. And he did this in Pacific Edge. In a utopia, there's still A falls in love with B, who's in love with C, who is in love with A, and they're all miserable, or A is in love with B, and then he dies. Utopia does not guarantee human happiness. It just takes away unnecessary suffering by way of political oppression. Another way is to define utopia as not a perfect end-state society. That's impossible anyway. You define it as a progressive movement in history with each generation doing better than the generation before in substantial ways in terms of equality, justice, and sustainability. It's a process, not a product. So utopia is just a name for one kind of story. I do that a lot. Lastly, Iain Banks was great at this. In his space opera novels, there was a post-scarcity galactic utopia, but it's always under assault by forces that don't like it. He was one of the greatest writers of my generation in so many ways, but especially in terms of stage business and exciting plots, Iain was the master. His utopian society always had to defend itself, sometimes quite violently. So defense of utopia becomes like a war zone, and suddenly you're back to war novels. And then the utopia sits there as kind of a given, but it has to be defended. That's a great strategy that I haven't used as much as Iain. I learned from him, and I learned from Leguin. She always went right to the heart of the contradictions. If everybody's free to do what they want, who takes out the trash? What happens when there's a drought? Is there a police force? If there isn't, how do you control a violent person? In The Dispossessed, she basically went to every one of the problems utopia would have in terms of contradiction and dramatized that. I learned a lot from her too. And I would say those lessons are indeed reflected in these works. We have many characters who are not happy or not entirely happy, and we see growth taking place, a continual progression, as he's talking about, one which is continually threatened up on Mars, both by forces on Mars and by forces on Earth, and even in the expansion to the rest of the solar system. So I think that these interviews might be helpful for putting us into the right frame of mind for thinking about some of the great philosophical themes that are being worked out in Blue Mars. One of the aspects running throughout the Mars trilogy as a whole, and particularly in Blue Mars, is what we saw Robinson calling in one of the interviews anti-utopianism. And that is, you could say, putting forth, we might call it a new paradigm that is embodied and talked about and articulated over and over again on Mars. And through this, sort of a counterbalance to Earth when it comes to the other planets as well, which we're going to see some brief engagement with. And hopefully we'll get to talking about that in a bit. Now, is it a new paradigm, or is it rather a paradigm that isn't completely new, but often is frustrated, is not allowed to be applied and take place except in limited ways in the world and history that we know here on Earth? I think that's the actual answer. And I want to begin sort of deep in the book, jumping kind of ahead in the future. We have this really interesting chapter, Viriditas, which is a really important concept, and also, this whole discussion here where we're seeing this new transition for humanity. And we get this really interesting summary of what it is that a future historian is going to tell us. So I'm going to begin here. It says, in all these outer orbits, the Martian co-ops were extremely busy helping Martians and Terrans to emigrate to one of the new little worlds. And as the process continued and 100 and then 1,000 asteroids and moonlets were given a local habitation and a name, the process took fire, becoming what some called the explosive diaspora, others simply the accelerando. People took to the idea, and the project gathered an energy that was felt everywhere, expressing a growing sense of humanity's power to create, its vitality, and variety. And the accelerando was also understood to be humanity's response to the supreme crisis of the population surge, a crisis so severe it made the Terran flood of 2129 look in comparison like no more than a bad high tide. Many historians, sociologists, and other social observers attempted to explain the vibrant nature of this most self-conscious age. One school of historians, the Deluge group, looked back to the Great Terran Flood and declared it had been the cause of the new Renaissance, a forced jump to a higher level. Another school of thought put forth the so-called technical explanation. Humanity had passed through one of the transitions to a new level of technological competence. They maintained as it had every half century or so, right back to the first Industrial Revolution. The Deluge group tended to use the term diaspora, the technics the term accelerando. Then, in the 2170s, the Martian historian Charlotte Dorsia Brevia wrote and published a dense, multi-volumed analytical meta-history, as she called it, which maintained that the Great Flood had indeed served as a trigger point and technical advances as the enabling mechanism, but the specific character of the new Renaissance had been caused by something much more fundamental, which was the shift from one kind of global socioeconomic system to the next. She described what she called a residual emergent complex of overlapping paradigms in which each great socioeconomic era was composed of roughly equal parts of the systems immediately adjacent to it in past and future. The periods immediately before and after were not the only ones involved, however. They formed the bulk of a system and comprised its most contradictory components, but additional important features came from particularly persistent aspects of more archaic systems and also faint, hesitant intuitions of developments that would not flower until much later. Feudalism, therefore, to take one example, was for Charlotte made up of a clash of the residual system of absolute religious monarchy, the emergent system of capitalism with important echoes of the more archaic tribal caste, and faint foreshadowings of later individualist humanisms. The clashing of these forces shifted over time until the Renaissance of the 16th century ushered in the age of capitalism. Capitalism then was composed of clashing elements of the residual feudalism and an emergent future order that was only now being defined in their own time, which Charlotte called democracy. And now, Charlotte claimed, they were, on Mars at least, in the democratic age itself. Capitalism had therefore, like all other ages, been the combination of two systems in very sharp opposition to each other. The incompatibility of its constituent parts was underlined by the unfortunate experience of capitalism's critical shadow, socialism, which had theorized true democracy and called for it, but in the attempt to enact it had used the methods at hand for its time, the same feudal methods, so prevalent in capitalism itself, so that both versions of the mix had ended up as destructive and unjust as their common residual parent. The feudal hierarchies in capitalism had been mirrored in the lived socialist experiments, and so the whole era had remained a highly charged, chaotic struggle, exhibiting different versions of the dynamic struggle between feudalism and democracy. Now, notice where we're going to go next. But the democratic age had finally, on Mars, emerged from the capitalist age. And this age, too, following the logic of Charlotte's paradigm, was necessarily a clash of residual and emergent between the contentious, competitive residuals of the capitalist system and some emergent aspects of an order beyond democracy, one that could not be fully characterized yet, as it had never existed, but which Charlotte ventured to call harmony or general goodwill. This speculative leap she made partly by studying closely how different cooperative economics was from capitalism, and partly by taking an even larger metahistorical perspective and identifying a broad general movement in history, which commentators called her big seesaw, a movement from the deep residuals of the dominance hierarchies of our primate ancestors on the savannah, toward the very slow, uncertain, difficult, predetermined free emergence of a pure harmony and equality, which would then characterize the very truest democracy. Both of these, the long-term clashing elements, had always existed, Charlotte maintained, creating the big seesaw, with the balance between them slowly and irregularly shifting over all human history. Dominance hierarchies had underlain every system ever realized so far, but at the same time, democratic values had always been a hope and a goal, expressed in every primate sense of self, and resentment of hierarchies that, after all, had to be imposed by force. And so, as the seesaw of this meta-history had shifted balance over the centuries, the noticeably imperfect attempts to institute democracy had slowly gained power. Thus, a very small percentage of humans had counted as true equals in slaveholding societies like ancient Greece or revolutionary America, and in the circle of true equals had only enlarged a bit more in the later capitalist democracies. But as each system moved on to the next, the circle of equal citizens had bloomed wider by a slight or great margin, until now not only were all humans, in theory at least anyway, equal, but consideration was being given to other animals, even to plants, ecosystems, and the elements themselves. These last extensions of citizenship Charlotte considered to be among the foreshadowings of the emergent system that might come after democracy per se, Charlotte's postulated period of utopian harmony. These glimmerings were faint in Charlotte's distant hoped-for future, a vague hypothesis when Saxe Russell read the later volumes of her work, poring avidly over the endless examples and arguments. For this account is a severe abridgment of her work, a mere abstract only. And I won't go on further, but this is quite important. What do we have here? Charlotte is representing, and she's, by the way, also coming from Dorsia Brevia, which is one of the places on Mars where this thought and work is being carried out, as we'll talk about. But what we've got here is this democratic age, which is anti-utopian in the way that Robinson has articulated that, using Grammas's semantic square. And it's motivated by, or sandwiched, bookended by, an age yet to come, that of harmony, which is indeed utopian. And notice what Robinson is doing here in this. I think this is actually one of the passages that holds the entire thing together and motivates what Robinson is doing in the entire work. Let's see some sort of manifestations of this. I think the next passage that we want to go to in Blue Mars is early on in the chapter A New Constitution, where they are forming a Congress. So, and again, Dorsia Brevia plays an important role. The constitutional scholars from Dorsia Brevia agreed the Congress should be conducted by members of the voting delegations, and the final result then voted on by the populace at large. So what do we have here? Representative politics, democratic politics. Not in the sense that we're used to today, where money and party affiliation has essentially corrupted the process at so many different levels, almost irredeemably, at least here in the United States, but genuine representative politics. So, what do we have going on here? Charlotte, who had helped draft the Dorsia Brevia document 12 Mars years before, had led a group since then in working up plans for a government in anticipation of a successful revolution. So there's groundwork being laid there, right? They were not the only ones to have done this. Schools in South Fassa and at the university in Sabishi had taught courses in the matter, and many of the young natives in the warehouse were well versed in the ideas or the issues they were tackling. It's kind of scary, Art remarked to Nadia, when a revolution and a bunch of lawyers pop out of the woodwork. And so what do they actually have? Charlotte's group made a list of potential delegates to a constitutional Congress, including all Martian settlements with populations over 500. Quite a few people would therefore be represented twice, Nadia pointed out, once by location and again by political affiliation. The few groups not on the list complained to the new committee, which allowed almost all petitioners to join. So it's a very broad perspective that is being taken in. And this is essential to any sort of real democratic politics. You take in everybody's voices. So I will just read this off. After about a week's jockeying, they had enough agreement to call for a vote of approval of the delegate list. So they suddenly had a real Congress. It was made up of the following delegations with anywhere from 1 to 10 people in each delegation. Towns: Acheron, Nicosia, Cairo, Edessa, and we could go on and on and on. There are, several dozen towns here. Political parties and organizations. Boonians, the followers of, John Boone's vision. Reds, those who want to keep Mars as much as possible not terraformed and sometimes engage in violent action. Bogodonovists, the followers of Arcady, who dies very early on in the series in Red Mars, but who is one of the first people to say, we don't have to do things the way that the Earth people want us to do them. Schellingistas, Mars First, which will become the most important political party on Mars. Free Mars, rather. The Ka, Praxis, which is a Swiss metanational company who wound up being on Mars and having an important role in things. The Kahirian Majari League, Green Mars, those who want to terraform and bring about life further. The United Nations Transitional Authority, one of the enemies for a long time of that. Kakakze, the editorial board of the Journal of Aerological Studies. Academics are playing a role in this. The Space Elevator Authority. Christian Democrats, the Meta-National Economic Activity Coordination Committee, right? The Meta-Nats are some of the people who are the most problematic, or the forces most problematic on Earth. Bogonian neo-Marxists, Friends of the Earth, Biotique, Separation de l'Atmosphère. General meetings, then, he says, began in the morning around the table, moved out into the small working groups, and they talk about what's going on with this committee. In the first week, many arguments concerned simply what a constitution was, what form it should take, and whether they should have one at all. Charlotte called this the meta-conflict, the argument about what the argument was about. A very important matter, she said, when she saw Nadia squint unhappily. Why? Because in settling it, we set the limits on what we can decide. If we decide to include economic and social issues in the Constitution, for instance, this will be a very different kind of thing than if we stick to purely political or legal matters, or even a very general statement of principles. And they decide to take the bold route. Now, there's a number of things that I want to bring up in here that show us, the aspects of the new paradigm that is being developed on Mars and really being offered to us, under the table, you might say, as readers of this by Kim Stanley Robinson. One of the very important things that comes up at the beginning in this A New Constitution is the issue of rights. So, there's a sort of conflict there between, as Nadia says, people claiming that some fundamental right is foreign to their culture. That stinks no matter who says it. Fundamentalists, patriarchs, Leninists, Meta-Nats, I don't care who, they're not going to get away with it here, not if I can help it. Art noticed more than a few delegates frowning at this sentiment, which struck them as a version of Western secular relativism, or perhaps John Boone's hyper-Americanism. Opposition to Meta-Nats had included many people trying to hold on to their older cultures, and these often had their hierarchies, notice that term, pretty well intact. The ones at the top end of the hierarchies liked them that way, and so did a surprisingly large number of people further down the ladder. But the young Martian natives, however, looked surprised that this was even an issue. To them, the fundamental rights were innate and irrevocable, and any challenge to them that struck them as just one more of the many emotional scars that the Issei were always revealing as a result of their traumatic, dysfunctional Terran upbringings. Ariadne, one of the most prominent of the young natives, stood up to say that the Dorsia Brevia group had studied many Terran human rights documents and had written a comprehensive list of their own. The new master list of fundamental individual rights was available for discussion, and, she implied, adoption wholesale. Some argued about one point or another, but it was generally agreed that a global Bill of Rights of some kind should be on the table. So Martian values, as they existed in Martian year 52, were about to be codified and made a principal component in the Constitution. The exact nature of these rights was still a matter of controversy. The so-called political rights were generally agreed to be self-evident, things citizens were free to do, things governments were forbidden to do, like habeas corpus, freedom of movement, speech, association, religion, a ban on weapons. All of these were approved by a vast majority of Martian natives, though there were some Issei from places like Singapore, Cuba, Indonesia, Thailand, China, who looked askance at so much emphasis on individual liberty. Other delegates had reservations about a different kind of right, the so-called social or economic rights, such as the right to housing, healthcare, education, employment, a share of the value generated by natural resource use. Many Issei delegates without actual experience in Terran government were quite worried about these, pointing out that it was dangerous to enshrine such things in the Constitution. It had been done on Earth, they said, and then when it was found impossible to meet with such promises, the Constitution guaranteeing them was seen as a propaganda device and flouted in other areas as well until it became a bad joke. Even so, Mikhail said sharply, if you can't afford housing, then it is your right to vote that it is the bad joke. The young natives agreed, as did many others there. So economic or social rights were on the table too, and arguments over how to actually guarantee these rights in practice continued through many a long session. Political, social, it's all one, Nadia said. Let's make all the rights work. So imagine this. Again, not utopian, but anti-utopian. Working through the problems in granting to people, granting to human beings, a full set of rights. So a little bit later in a new constitution, we hear what's, point 4 in the Dorsa Brevia agreement. Everybody's work is their own, and the worth of it cannot be taken away. The various modes of production belong to those who created them and to the common good of the future generations. It says that the world is something we all steward together. So, very often we think of rights as, if we grant people rights, they're going to be too individualistic and they're not going to they're all going to take their share. This has a sustainability, future generations aspect to it. So it goes on, that has been our work these last 50 years. In the system we've developed, all economic enterprises are to be small cooperatives owned by their workers and no one else. They hire their management or manage themselves. Industry guilds and co-op associations will form the larger structures necessary to regulate trade and the market, share capital, and create credit. And then somebody says, these are nothing but ideas. It's utopianism and nothing more. And then, not at all. The system is based on models from Terran history, and its various parts have all been tested on both worlds and succeeded very well. Now, here's a really important point. You don't know about this partly because you're ignorant and partly because meta-nationalism itself steadfastly ignored and denied all our alternatives to it. But most of our microeconomy has been in successful operation for centuries in the Mondragon region of Spain. The different parts of the macroeconomy have been used in the pseudo-metnat praxis in Switzerland, in India's state of Kerala, and Bhutan. He goes on and on and on, right? And these organizations were the precursors to our economy. Now notice this line, which will be democratic in a way capitalism never even tried to be. A synthesis of systems, right? So this is, again, advancing some important ideas. And, through these characters, Robinson is pointing out, these are not utopian ideas. Again, anti-utopian. These have been done. They actually do work. We have to provide the resolute support for them, right? In Green Earth, we have this very interesting discussion between Michael and Sachs, and we're going to come and Nirgal, and we're going to come back to Michael in just a bit. This is what Nirgal is saying. Mars is a mirror in which Terra sees its own essence. The move to Mars was a purifying voyage, stripping away all but the most important things. What arrived in the end was Terran through and through, and what has happened since there has been an expression of Terran thought and Terran genes. And so more than any material aid in scarce metals or new genetic strains, we can most help the home planet by serving as a way for you Terrans, to see yourselves, and as a way to map out an unimaginable immensity. In our small way, we do our part to create the great civilization that trembles on the brink of becoming. We are the primitives of an unknown civilization. That's what it looks like to us on Mars anyway, a long evolution through the centuries towards justice and peace. As people learn more, they understand better their dependence on each other and on their world. On Mars, we have seen that the best way to express this interdependence is to live for giving in a culture of compassion. Every person free and equal in the sight of all, working together for the good of all. It's that work that makes us most free. No hierarchy is worth acknowledging but this one. The more we give, the greater we become. Now in the midst of a great flood, spurred by the great flood, we see the flowering of this culture of compassion emerging on both two worlds at once. Now, that does get a little bit utopian, right? Because we're going to see there's lots and lots of problems, not just, on Earth, but also on Mars as well. So let's go back a little bit to this very interesting discussion, which again brings up semiotic squares, right? And it's Sachs and Michael. Michael, remember, is the psychotherapist and sort of a voice in the ears of so many of the other characters. And they bring up this. They're talking about remembering things and trauma. Michael says, there were 50 women in the first 100. Odds are that more than one of them were abused by men in their life, more likely 10 or 15 if the statistics are to be believed. Sexually violated, struck, mistreated. That's just the way it was. Old paradigm, one of hierarchy, right? Sachs says, it's hard to believe. Michael says, yes. Sachs recalled hitting Phyllis in the jaw. Phyllis is the one of the 100 who not only, becomes part of the power structure, trying to let the Metnats control Mars, but also captures Sachs and does horrible things to him. Everyone has their reasons, Michael said, startling him, or so they think. He tried to explain, in his usual Michael fashion, to make it something other than plain evil. At the base of human culture is a neurotic response to people's earliest psychic wounds. Before birth and during infancy, people exist in a narcissistic oceanic bliss in which the individual is the universe. Then, sometime in late infancy, we come to the awareness we're separate individuals, different from our mother and everyone else. This is a blow from which we never completely recover. There are several neurotic strategies used to try to deal with it. First, merging back into the mother. Then denying the mother and shifting our ego ideal to the father. This strategy often lasts forever, and the people of that culture worship their king and their father god and so on. Or the ego ideal might shift again to abstract ideas or to the brotherhood of man. There are names and full descriptions for all of these complexes. The Dionysian, the Persian, the Apollonian, the Heraclean. They all exist, and they're all neurotic in that they all lead to misogyny, except for the Dionysian complex. This is one of your semantic rectangles? Sachs asked apprehensively. Yes. The Apollonian and Heraclean complexes might describe Terran industrial societies, the Persian, its earlier cultures, with strong remnants of course right up to this day, and they are all three patriarchal. They all denied the maternal, which was connected in patriarchy with the body and nature. The feminine was instinct, the body and nature, while the masculine was reason and mind and the law ruled. Sachs, fascinated by so much throwing together, said only, and on Mars? Well, on Mars it may be that the ego ideal is shifting back to the maternal, to the Dionysian again, or to some kind of post-Oedipal reintegration with nature, which we are still in the process of inventing, some new complex that would not be so subject to neurotic over-investment. Sachs shook his head. It was amazing how floridly elaborated a pseudoscience could get, a compensation technique perhaps, a desperate attempt to be more like physics. But what they did not understand is that physics, while admittedly complicated, was always trying very hard to become simpler. Michael, however, was continuing to elaborate. Correlated to patriarchy was capitalism, he was saying, a hierarchical system in which most men had been exploited economically, also treated like animals, poisoned, betrayed, shoved around, shot, and even in the best of circumstances under constant threat of being tossed aside, out of a job, poor, unable to provide for loved dependents, hungry, humiliated. Some, trapped in this unfortunate system, took out their rage at their plight on whoever they could, even if that turned out to be their loved ones, the people most likely to give them comfort. It was illogical and even stupid, brutal and stupid. Yes, Michael shrugged. He didn't like where this train of reasoning had led him. It sounded to Sachs like the implication that many men's actions indicated that they were, alas, fairly stupid, and the limbic array got all twisted in some minds. Michael was going on trying to veer away from that to make a decent explanation. So he goes on. Sachs interprets him as explaining away evil, when Michael, arguably, I think, on the part of Robinson, is actually explaining something about the possibility for moving past trauma, and we nowadays call it disorder rather than neurosis, but complexes that tend to make people either cooperative with or accepting of these very unequal, undemocratic, hierarchical systems which don't benefit them, even when they're allowed to kick downward. Going on a little bit further, coming back to Free Mars. Free Mars was now a political party, the biggest on Mars. It had not always been that way. It had begun as something more like a network of friends or the part of the underground that lived in the demimonde. Mostly ex-students in the university in Sabishi, or later the members of a very loose association of communities in the tented canyons and clandestine clubs in the city and so forth. A kind of vague umbrella term for those sympathetic to the underground, and not followers of any more specific political movement or philosophy, just something they said, in fact, Free Mars. Something like that can be a catalyst, can take on its own sort of impetus, its own value, its own capacity to connect people. So it goes on. In many ways, it had been Nergal's creation. So many of the natives had been interested in autonomy, and the various parties based on thoughts of one early settler or another did not appeal to them, and they wanted something new. So Nergal had traveled around the planet and stayed with people who organized meetings or discussions, and this had gone on for so long, eventually people wanted a name. People want names for things. And so, Free Mars. And in the revolution, we're talking about the second revolution, it had become a rallying point for the natives, rising up out of society as a kind of emergent phenomenon, and with many more people declaring themselves members than one would have guessed possible. Millions, the native majority, the very definition of the revolution, in fact, the main reason for its success. Free Mars as a sentence, as an imperative, and they had done it. So, this is quite important. We're going to see that there are challenges with that. Jackie is going to try to take control. We also have other characters getting involved as well. We come back to the discussion of hierarchy and property and patriarchy. And we have a very interesting engagement between Sachs and Bao here. And it's bringing up Michael. Sachs thought he could see what Michael meant about culture keeps progressing. There were rapid changes in attitudes to many things. Veritas Vandal, as Bella called it, mutation of values. But they still lived in a society struggling with archaisms of all sorts. Primates banding into tribes, guarding a territory, praying to a god like a cartoon parent. Sometimes I don't think there's been any progress at all, he said, feeling strangely disconsolate. But Sachs, Michael protested, right here on Mars we have seen both patriarchy and property brought to an end. It's one of the greatest achievements in human history. If true, Sachs says. Don't you think women have as much power as men now? Well, as far as I can tell, perhaps even more when it comes to reproduction. Well, that would make sense. And the land is in the shared stewardship of everybody. We still own personal items as property, but land as property has never happened here. There's a new social reality. Very important term. And he says, we struggle with it every day. So they did. And Sachs remembered how bitter the conflicts had been in the old days when property and capital had been the order of the day. Yes, perhaps it was true. Patriarchy and property were now in the process of being dismantled, at least on Mars, at least for now. As with string theory, it might take a long time to work it in any proper state. After all, Sachs himself, who had no prejudices whatsoever, had been amazed to see a woman mathematician at work, or more precise, a woman genius, by whom he'd been promptly hypnotized, so to speak, with every other man in the theory group, to the point of being quite distraught by her departure. Uneasily, he said, on Earth, people seem to be fighting as much as before. Even Michael had to admit it. There are too many people down there and more all the time. You saw what it was like during our visit. As long as Earth is in that situation, Mars is under threat, and so we fight it up here, too. Sachs took the point. In a way, it was comforting. Human behavior is not irreducibly stupid or evil, but is responding semi-rationally to a given historical situation, a danger, seeing what one could with the notion that there might not be enough for all, doing everything possible to protect one's offspring, which of course endangered all offspring by the aggregate of individual selfish actions. But at least it could be called an attempt to reason at first approximation. It's not as bad as it was anyway, Michael was saying. Even on Earth, people are having far fewer children, and they're reorganizing into collectives pretty well, considering the flood and all the trouble that preceded it. A lot of new social movements down there, a lot of them inspired by what we're doing here and by what Nurgle does. Now, again, we see this constant theme of the possibility of a new paradigm, a new society that becomes possible on this imaginary Mars, which Robinson is advocating for us to try to make here on Earth before it's too late, right? I think that's probably enough about these grand themes. You see where it's going. It's, once again, to use the very important terms, not utopianism in the foolish, Pollyannish, unrealistic sense, but which is a endpoint, right? But anti-utopianism, going against those who would set up dystopias or those who are dismissive of utopia as such, always raising the problems with it as a reason to not do anything different, to stay where we currently are, which is on a track that is not static, but dynamic, and leading eventually to, according to Robinson, environmental and human, on every level, catastrophe. So these are some, I think, very, very important philosophical themes, all coming together, developing over time, looked at from multiple points of view through the eyes and actions and words of the various characters involved in this, including that meta-historical analysis that we began with here. We are already now past the 90-minute mark that I had originally set for this online series, each of the videos, and I've been transgressing that limit quite a bit in the last year or so. So I'm going to try to wrap this one up here. You notice there's a lot of great philosophical themes interwoven into this series, and I hope that you will be provoked or perhaps cajoled into getting your hands on them and reading them if you haven't already. And if you have read them, I hope you got something out of this discussion of the Mars trilogy, or as Robinson himself tells us, this 1,700-page single novel in 3 volumes. And, we've got plenty of other great science fiction, fantasy, horror, other speculative fiction authors and series coming up, slated for the rest of the year. I hope that you'll join me for some of those sessions as well. And if you're, this is number 69 in the series, so if you're interested in seeing who else, there's a link to the playlist, and you'll also see one at the very end of this video. So just click on that, and you can see all of the other previous sessions, authors, who we've covered. And, the intention is to keep this series going on for as long as people are interested in it, and as long as there's more authors and series and narrative worlds for me to explore. The odds of running out of those, pretty low. So let's bring this one to a close. Thanks for watching this far, and I hope that you will take a look, or a relook, at this wonderful Mars trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson.